In 1815, one family knew the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo before every king in Europe. They used that information to make a fortune in a single day that would take their competitors a generation to match. At their peak, the Rothschilds were worth more than the GDP of France. They financed wars, they toppled governments, they moved markets with a single letter. Today, not one Rothschild sits on any major bank's board, not one controls a significant financial institution. The family that once dictated terms to emperors now manages a mid-sized investment firm that most people on Wall Street have never heard of. This is the story of how the most powerful banking dynasty in human history became ordinary, and why that story has been hidden for a very long time. Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born in 1744 in the Judengasse of Frankfurt. The Judengasse was a ghetto, not a neighborhood with that name, an actual ghetto. A single street, locked at night, locked on Sundays, locked on Christian holidays, locked whenever the city of Frankfurt decided it needed to be locked. The Jews of Frankfurt were not citizens. They were tolerated residents who paid special taxes for the privilege of existing within the city walls. The street was narrow enough that two cars could barely pass each other. It flooded regularly. It burned repeatedly and was rebuilt the same way each time, because the city would not permit its Jewish residents to build anything better. At its peak, it housed 3,000 people in conditions that would have been considered inadequate for livestock in the surrounding countryside. Mayer Amschel grew up in this street. His father Moses was a cloth merchant and money changer, who died of smallpox when Mayer was 12, taking with him whatever modest financial security the family had managed to accumulate. What Moses left behind was something more durable than money. He had taught his son that in a world that locked you in at night and taxed you for breathing, the only protection was knowledge, specifically knowledge of things that other people needed and could not easily obtain elsewhere. Mayer Amschel applied this lesson to coins. Rare coins were, in the 18th century, a serious field of study among wealthy European collectors. Princes and noblemen competed to acquire unusual specimens. The market was opaque, the expertise was scarce, and the margins for a skilled dealer were significant. Mayer Amschel spent years developing expertise in rare coins that no one in Frankfurt could match. He built a catalog. He developed relationships with dealers across Europe. He learned which collectors wanted what, and he positioned himself as the indispensable intermediary between supply and demand. His most important client was Wilhelm IX, the Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, one of the wealthiest princes in Europe. Wilhelm had inherited a fortune built on the rental of his subjects as soldiers to foreign powers, most famously to the British during the American Revolutionary War. He had more money than he knew what to do with, and a collector's passion for rare coins. Mayer Amschel became his dealer, then his financial agent, then gradually and carefully his banker. The relationship with Wilhelm was the foundation on which everything else was built. A Jewish merchant in a locked ghetto had made himself indispensable to one of the most powerful princes in Europe. He had done it not through connections he was born with, because he had none, and not through capital he had inherited, because there was none. He had done it through knowledge and through the systematic cultivation of trust over years. By the time he died in 1812, Mayer Amschel had built a bank in Geboken house that was operating in 5 European capitals simultaneously. He had sent each of his 5 sons to a different city. Amschel stayed in Frankfurt, Salomon went to Vienna, Nathan went to London, Kalman went to Naples, Jacob went to Paris. 5 cities, 5 banks, 1 family, 1 set of rules that Mayer Amschel had established before he died and that his sons followed, with a discipline that no other banking family of the era could match. The rules were simple. The family would only lend to governments, not to merchants or individuals. They would maintain their own courier network rather than relying on public postal systems. They would share information between the 5 houses continuously and completely, and they would never allow a significant business decision to be made by one house without the knowledge of the others. What Mayer Amschel had built was not a bank, it was a network, and in the early 19th century, when information traveled at the speed of a horse, and the difference between knowing something first and knowing it second could be worth millions, A network was the most valuable thing in the world. Nathan Mayer Rothschild in London was the most gifted of the 5 brothers and the one who transformed the family from wealthy bankers into a force that governments genuinely feared. Who had arrived in England in 1798 with a modest amount of capital and the trading contacts his father had developed in Frankfurt. Within a decade, he was the dominant force in the London bond market. Within 2 decades, he was financing the British government's wars against Napoleon. The courier network his father had established became, under Nathan's management, the fastest private intelligence system in Europe. Rothschild agents traveled by dedicated riders, by private boats, through routes that public messengers did not use. When Nathan needed to know something, he found out before anyone else. When he did not need to know something, he often found out anyway, because information was the raw material of his business, and you could never have too much of it. The Waterloo story is the most famous example of how this worked. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon met the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo in what both sides understood would be the decisive battle of the Napoleonic Wars. The outcome would determine the fate of Europe for a generation. Every government on the continent was waiting for news. Nathan Rothschild's agents were at the battle, not to fight, to observe and report. The news of Wellington's victory reached Nathan in London on June 19th, more than a day before the British government's own dispatches arrived. He went to the stock exchange. He stood at his usual pillar, and then, very quietly, he began to sell British government bonds. The traders around him watched. Rothschild was selling. Rothschild always knew things before everyone else. If Rothschild was selling, something must be wrong. The news from Waterloo must be bad. They sold too. The market fell. Nathan waited. When the price had dropped far enough, he bought everything he could, at prices that reflected a British defeat that had not happened. When the actual news arrived the following day and the market recovered, Nathan Rothschild's profit from a single day of trading was enough to change the financial history of the family permanently. The story has been disputed by some historians who question whether the Waterloo trade happened exactly as described. What is not disputed is that Nathan Rothschild used his information advantage systematically and brilliantly throughout the Napoleonic period, and that by the time the wars ended, the Rothschild family was the most powerful private financial force in Europe. The century that followed Waterloo was the Rothschild century. They financed the British government's purchase of the Suez Canal in 1875, providing £4 million in 48 hours, when Disraeli needed the money before Parliament could authorize it. They financed the Cecil Rhodes mining operations that would become De Beers. They financed the construction of railways across Europe and South America. They were the primary bankers to the Habsburg Empire, the French government, the British Crown, and at various points, most of the major powers of Europe simultaneously. Their wealth at peak has been estimated at figures that are almost impossible to comprehend. Some historians place the combined Rothschild fortune in the mid-19th century at roughly 2% of global economic output. In today's terms, that would be approximately $2 trillion. They were not simply wealthy. They were structurally embedded in the financial architecture of European civilization in a way that made them, for practical purposes, impossible to remove. Governments that needed to borrow money came to the Rothschilds. Governments that needed to refinance their debts came to the Rothschilds. Governments that needed to finance wars came to the Rothschilds. The power this created was not the power of elected officials or military commanders. It was quieter than that and in many ways more durable. A general could be defeated. A prime minister could be voted out. The Rothschilds could not be replaced, because there was nothing to replace them with, until there was. The first crack appeared in a place the family did not expect. In 1863, the Rothschilds declined to participate in the financing of the American Civil War on the Union side. The reasons were complex and have been debated by historians, but the practical consequence was that the United States government, unable to rely on traditional European banking relationships, was forced to develop new financial mechanisms. J. Cook and Company pioneered the mass marketing of government bonds directly to ordinary American citizens. J.P. Morgan built a financial empire that did not depend on the Rothschild network. When the United States emerged from the Civil War as the largest and fastest growing economy in the world, das heißt ausgelast an the world, it had done so without the Rothschilds. The family that had been indispensable to European finance was, in the most important new financial market in the world, simply absent. This was not fatal in 1865. Europe was still the center of global finance, but it was a structural weakness that would matter enormously 50 years later. The second crack was the First World War. The Rothschilds had built their fortune on the principle that lending to governments was safe, because governments did not default on debts owed to the family, that all other governments also depended on. The First World War destroyed this logic completely. 4 European empires collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which the Vienna Rothschilds had served for a century, ceased to exist. The Russian Empire, which the family had complicated relationships with, was overthrown and replaced by a government that repudiated foreign debts entirely. The German Empire was replaced by a republic that would, within 15 years, be governed by people who considered the Rothschilds a primary enemy. The family's European network, built over a century on the assumption that the governments it served would continue to exist, suddenly found its self-serving governments that had either collapsed or been transformed beyond recognition. The Paris and London houses survived. The Vienna house was mortally wounded. The Frankfurt house, the original house, the house Meyer-Amschel had built on the Judengasse, closed in 1901, before the war, as the generation that had known the family's founding principles died off, and their descendants decided that other careers were more appealing than banking. The Nazis completed what the First World War had begun. When Hitler came to power in 1933, the Rothschilds were still operating in Vienna and Paris. Louis von Rothschild ran the Vienna house with the calm of a man who had seen European politics convulsed before and always recovered. He stayed too long. When Germany annexed Austria in March 1938, Louis von Rothschild was arrested at Vienna airport, attempting to leave the country. He was held for a year. His release was eventually negotiated in exchange for the transfer of Rothschild industrial assets in Austria to German control, assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars at the time. The Vienna house was seized. The assets were transferred. Louis von Rothschild arrived in the United States with almost nothing and spent the rest of his life as a gentleman farmer in Vermont, tending livestock on a modest property, the last representative of a line that had once held the financial fate of the Habsburg Empire in its hands. The Paris house was occupied by Nazi forces in 1940. The family's art collection, one of the greatest private collections in Europe, accumulated over more than a century, was systematically looted. Paintings, furniture, objects that had taken generations to acquire, disappeared into Nazi storage facilities and private German collections. Some were recovered after the war. Many were not. The family rebuilt in Paris after the liberation, but they rebuilt smaller. The infrastructure of the European network that had made them untouchable was gone. The governments they had served no longer existed or no longer needed them in the same way. The world had changed, and the Rothschilds had not been given the choice of whether to change with it. The post-war Rothschilds faced a different kind of erosion. In France, the nationalization of the banking sector under various governments throughout the 20th century progressively reduced the family's ability to operate as an independent private bank. The French Rothschild Bank was nationalized entirely in 1981 under the Mitterrand government. The family rebuilt again, this time through a new bank established by David de Rothschild, but they were rebuilding in a world that had moved on. The American financial system had become dominant. The great investment banks of the post-war era, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Lehman Brothers, were not Rothschild institutions. The family was present in European finance, respected and connected, but it was no longer indispensable in the way that Nathan Rothschild had been indispensable. There were too many alternatives. The information advantage that had been the foundations of the family's power had been democratized by telegraph, telephone, and eventually computer networks that anyone could access. The Rothschild family today operates a mid-sized investment bank. It is a good bank, well regarded by those who work with it. Its revenues and profits are a fraction of the major financial institutions that now dominate global finance. The family that once moved markets with a letter now competes for the same mandates as dozens of other firms with similar capabilities. The fall of the Rothschilds is not a story about spending or inheritance, taxes, or the mathematics of dividing a fortune among too many heirs, though all of those things played roles. It is a story about the nature of the advantage that built the fortune in the first place. Mayer Amschel Rothschild built an empire on information asymmetry. He knew things that other people did not know. His sons knew things faster than any competitor could. The network they built existed to create and maintain an information advantage that translated directly and reliably into financial advantage. That advantage was real, and it was enormous, and it lasted for nearly a century. But it was not permanent because no information advantage is permanent. The world eventually built infrastructure, telegraphs, telephones, news agencies, financial information services that distributed information broadly enough to destroy the structural edge the Rothschilds had built their entire model on. When the edge disappeared, what remained was a family with significant wealth and excellent connections and genuine skill, but without the structural advantage that had made them uniquely powerful. They became, in the most precise sense of the word, ordinary, successful, respected, comfortable, but ordinary. The house on the Judengasse in Frankfurt no longer exists. It was demolished in the 19th century. Long before the Nazis arrived, the street itself was destroyed during the Second World War and was not rebuilt. The boy who grew up in a locked ghetto and turned a coin collection into an empire that financed the wars of Europe had built something so specific to its moment in history that when the moment passed, the thing he built could not fully survive it. That is the truth about all great fortunes built on structural advantage rather than continuous reinvention. They last as long as the structure does, and structures, no matter how solid they appear, are always temporary. Everything is. Subscribe if this one changed how you understand financial power. Next week we go deeper into the dynasties that shaped the world and the ones that history quietly erased. The real story is never the one on the surface.